Hey, you found the podcast, the Last Storyteller Podcast. My name's Jim. I'm your host. We are in season 9, and season 9 has been dedicated to talking to storytellers, writers, independent writers, people who have sat down at a keyboard, taken a bunch of words, and turned those into a story to be read, listened to, and enjoyed. And today, my author, when she's not jumping out of perfectly good airplanes, she writes. Her name is Bibi LeBlanc, and today we're going to talk about one of her many books, actually. It's called Wings of Freedom, a tribute to the Berlin Airlift. Bibi LeBlanc, welcome to The Last Storyteller.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for having me, and happy to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. I'm going to ask you right off to take us back to June 26, 1848, when the first flight of over 270,000 flights entered the airways over Berlin. Tell us about this story.
Right. Yes, it's a great story, and actually a story that found me. Uh, I grew up in Berlin and never knew anything about it until a few years ago when some things happened in my life and led me to this amazing chapter of history. And so let me give you a little bit of background information. 3 years at the end of World War II in 1945, Germany was divided by the winning Allied countries, right? The US, England, France, and the Soviet Union. And each had their zone of occupation. Berlin was the capital of Germany. It was also divided into the French, US, English, and Soviet sectors. So from now on, it was referred to as West Berlin and East Berlin. And pretty soon it became very clear that the Soviet Union had vastly different ideas of what was to happen with Berlin and Germany. They had different ideas than the Western Allies did. So they were supposed to make decisions unanimously. Well, at some point, that just was all falling apart. And on June 24th, 1948, the Soviet Union decided to cut off all land and water access to Berlin. They closed the Autobahn for repairs. They took up railroad tracks so trains couldn't get through, and they closed the waterways. And all in an attempt for the Western Allies not to be able to bring in food and coal and everything that was needed into West Berlin to keep the people, fed and warm and all that. And so then the Western Allies had some choices to make. Nobody wanted to start World War III. And so they decided to bring in supplies by air. And there were 3 air corridors that they could use and fly in. And that was negotiated with a contract in 1945 at the end of the war, whereas all the other access was not contractually agreed upon. It was just, a verbal agreement. And so they started on the date you just mentioned, June 28, 1948, they started flying in supplies by air. And really, it was just in the hopes of continuing the conversations with the Soviets. Nobody expected it to last any length of time and to be able to supply a city of 2.5 million people by air alone with airplanes. It was unfathomable. So that was the situation on that day.
Now, you were born in Germany, and you grew up where if you wanted to look over, you could see the Berlin Wall. It was still around when you were young.
Yes, I was born in 1963. I was born in the American sector of West Berlin, and in 1963, so just 2 years after the wall was built and a couple of months after Kennedy's famous speech, I'm a Berliner speech in West Berlin. Everybody remembers that.
So, yes, and you'd mentioned that this story of the Wings of Freedom, that it really you became more aware of it in the last few years. But as a child there, were these stories talked about?
Not really. Like nobody wanted to, because it was right in the aftermath of World War II. And in Germany, nobody wanted to talk about the war and what happened and, who was involved, who wasn't involved and all of that. And the airlift, for some reason, I never learned about it in school, which I think is terrible because it is such an incredible chapter of our history and transatlantic history, really, too. Our relationship with the U.S. was shaped by that for generations, still to this day.
And
They,
now you're sharing that story, and
yes.
you're right, it is an incredible story. I was aware of this, the, Wings of Freedom mission that took place so many years ago, and what I was surprised about is to recently find out how many flights there actually were, and over the period of time that this mission continued on. When you were doing your research into this, where did you have to go to find out about the history of this? Were there people that you were able to talk to? Was it just from news articles? How were you able to do? Because the research is very deep in your book. How were you able to obtain all that information?
Yeah, mostly through books, but also what started the whole thing was that a friend of mine texted me on Facebook. She said the Candy airplane is coming to your airport. I live in a small college town in Florida. She says the Candy bomber is coming to your airport. And like, I don't know why she even made that connection to me, but I took my mom out there because she says to this day, she remembers the taste of the milk powder that came with the care packages that were
Wow.
delivered during that time. Yes. So I took her
Wow.
out there more if I did it more for her than for out of personal interest or anything. But anyway, that airplane it's called the Spirit of Freedom, and it's owned by the Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation. And they set up the airplane like a museum on the inside, and they take it to air shows to tell the story of the airlift that's, in display cases and things inside the airplane. So that piqued my interest. I thought that was interesting. And then I went to Berlin shortly after and took a tour of the main airport that was used during the airlift. And then realized that was about to be the 75th anniversary of the airlift. And I'm like, if I'm going to do a book about this, because I've done other books, but if I'm going to do a book about this, I have to do it now. And I went home, I ordered all the books I could find on the airlift and took a deep dive. It didn't come up for air for weeks and months and put this book together. And whenever I had, when you read a lot of different books, you come across conflicting information sometimes. So then I reached out to a gentleman at the Allied Museum in Berlin who's an expert on this topic. And I said, I'm finding such and such and such conflicting information, what is right. And so he would tell me. And so all of that went into the book.
Was there information that you found that surprised you?
Oh, yes, lots of information and incredible stories. Like they used this, like the Tempelhof Airport at the time, which is now closed, but at the time they didn't even have runways yet. It was all grass. This is still the fairly early days of aviation. And it was all grass, and airplanes would just point their nose into the wind and take off or land. And so when the airlift started, that wasn't working out too well because it got muddy really quick. It rains a lot in Berlin. So they used these steel planks to build runways, and they have a lot of like holes, but they're steel planks. And so even that wasn't holding up. With all the heavily loaded airplanes, they started to crack. So they used crews of women, like 225 or so women on the sides of the runways. And after each landing, they would run onto the runway and fill the cracks with a mix of tar and dirt, and then, run back off before the next airplane landed a couple minutes later. There are so many incredible, like they built a runway at third airport in Tegel in Berlin, and they built that runway in 3 months. They had the first airplane landing there because they knew they needed more capacity through the winter because they needed to fly in more coal. And they used the rubble from the destroyed city. Berlin was, like some people say, 70% destroyed, the buildings. And you can only imagine what that looked like. And so they used some of the rubble from the city to lay the foundation for that runway, and then flew in the containers with cement or tar to go over the runway. And the machinery, they had to cut, there were all the big machines that were too big. So they cut them apart in the US, put the parts on the airplanes, flew them to Berlin and welded them back together. And, they're just, and then when you talk to the people who were there at the time, it's incredible the stories you hear.
It was after the war, but there was a rebuilding process, and it was going to take a lot of coordination, teamwork, and most importantly, a courage, I think, to do that, especially for the people that were that were living there, that had lived through the war. They're living in a city that had been destroyed, and they're trying to rebuild. And all of a sudden, there's another threat shortly after the war, an unexpected threat that was coming from Russia at the time. And your book, the stories that you tell focuses in on that courage of this unified effort to get this done. Again, it was over a period of time that all these flights took place, all the aid that was there. And writing this as a story, was there a focal point that you wanted to bring to a reader?
Yes, I think that what they accomplished is remarkable. If you look at the times we live in today, how divided we are on so many topics, and back then you have to imagine this is 3 years after the war, and all of a sudden airplanes start flying in again, and people at first were fearful, of the bombing starting again. But no, here they were, the people that were trying to kill each other 3 years earlier, all of a sudden they came together, and the English and the Americans were bringing in food to save the people. And people are like, how does this make any sense, But to come together like this, and then the Allied forces, they had to start using the Germans to unload the airplanes because they didn't have enough manpower in Europe at the time. The Soviets far outnumbered them. And so they had to start working together with the Germans in not only unloading the airplanes, but also the airplane mechanics, and the courage and the trust that took, I think, is remarkable.
Did the citizens not know about these plans from the beginning?
No, not really. Because I think it just unfolded. It wasn't a big plan at the beginning. It was, what do we do now? We can't bring food in. What do we do? And so the only option really were the airplanes, but nobody expected it to last for a long time. And it was summer. And so people could grow things, they created little gardens, any free space they could find. But then came winter and it got cold real fast and foggy and nothing would grow. And so the Russians just thought, by the time winter comes around, they're going to have to throw in the towel. There's no chance they can fly through all the fog. It was one of the foggiest winters in many years. And so they actually sustained it the blockade lasted for 10 months and 16 days until May. The airlift lasted a little bit longer until the end of September because the Allies wanted to make sure, they weren't going to reclose, the access to Berlin. So I lost track of your question. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. That's exactly right. They weren't aware of it. And all of a sudden this was happening, and it did sustain the citizens.
In England, Reginald Waite, you see him behind me, the guy with a ruler in his hand. He set up, one night, because there was an airlift that happened earlier. It's called the Little Lift in April because the Soviets were already giving the Allies a tough time. Sometimes they would stop the supply trains and stuff. So Reginald Waite had figured out, we can fly some stuff in. And so there was a Little Lift going on for a little while. And then when the blockade happened, that gentleman sat down all night, figured out, crunched all the numbers and said, we can supply Berlin by air. Let's give it a try. And it took him, going up the letter of command to get to General Clay and say, we can really do this. And then they agreed, okay, let's give this a try. And then General Clay in Berlin had to work with the Berlin mayor, Ernst Reuter, to make it happen. But I don't think anybody expected it would last for a long time. It just unfolded. And, when they saw that the Soviets weren't opening back up, and then there was General Tunner, who was a master of logistics, who figured out how to make it all work and really fine-tune it like a conveyor belt. They had airplanes flying in 5 different layers, the same type of airplanes on each layer, I think 3 minutes apart or something, and flying into Berlin. And if they missed their landing, they couldn't just circle because it was a mess in the airspace over Berlin. And he had experienced that in August. And so he was a master organizer behind the whole operation. So developed over time. I don't think there wasn't a plan in the beginning.
And it's an amazing story when we consider your story is not only about this mission, the Wings of Freedom, the Berlin air flight missions that were going on there, but it's also about the people that live there. And when we think about those, if I sit down and I think about them, it was 3 years, around 3 years post war, but nothing was really changing. It's a slow regrowth process. And the days I think they had to crawl along because nobody really knew where they were going. And then all of a sudden the world starts changing for them and giving hope back into that. The people that were there, their stories. Were you able to take their stories and really breathe life back into them? Because like you said, this is a forgotten story.
Yes, I'm working on that actually, because when I published that book 2 years ago, that was the 75th anniversary of the Berlin Airlift, the end of the blockade. I went to Germany several times to go to the different celebrations that they had in Berlin and in other places. And I met some of the people. Some of the veterans were still around. They're few and far between now.
Right.
But some of the people who were children during the airlift, and they started sharing their stories with me, what it was like back then. And I'm like, somebody needs to write these stories down, you know? And I said that to a couple of the people, and they said, well, duh, why don't you do it? You already. So last year I decided, yes, I'll take that on. And I am now in the process of interviewing people or getting their written stories about, you know, their memories and what it was like. And it's a project for right now. It's called Voices of the Berlin Airlift. And I've actually just set up a nonprofit organization because I feel like all of this is getting bigger than just me. And I feel like with an organization, I can ask for some support and funding, maybe from some government agencies or something. And in fact, I had a meeting with the German embassy in Washington and the British embassy, and they love that I'm doing this and are very much in support. So it's great. I'm also wanting to work on some curriculum to get it back into the schools, because I think it's terrible that kids are not learning about this in school, especially in Germany. Every German child should know that story because it shaped our world. You know, I didn't like growing up with a wall. And my goal in life as a young person was to leave Berlin as soon as I could, because I really felt the wall. You know, we couldn't just drive out to the countryside out of the city. And we always had to, when we wanted to leave, drive through the Soviet zone of occupation. And there were checkpoints and they would harass you. And it was really difficult and scary. And so I wanted to leave. And I did. Right after I finished high school, I left and moved to Hanover, and I was out of there. But now, looking back at that time is really interesting. And now I realize, when I learned about the airlift, I realized, had it not been for what they accomplished with the airlift, keeping West Berlin free, I would have grown up under the Soviets and probably the rest of West Germany. And who knows, maybe Western Europe. And our
Yes. It's a frightening thought. When we think about history and we think about the 90s and World War II, we seem to think about the Private Ryan type of moments and those big battles. And we forget that after every war, there's a process that comes after that, process of restoration that needs to be done. And nobody's writing about that. Nobody's remembering that. And then you focus in on that one moment in history, what you just referred to as a child, of how different it would have been if the Soviets had what their mission was at that time, which was to cripple what we at that time we were calling West Germany. The other Allied held areas, their mission was to cripple that. And if they did, how different the world would look today. It seems like we're always a breath away from another war. And we're fearful of that. And then there's battles fought. And then something happens after that. And we never hear about that because we're either victorious or we've lost. This story is incredible. Wings of Freedom, a tribute to the Berlin Airlift. You mentioned the second one that you were working on, and you also mentioned earlier before the podcast, you and I were talking about how busy you are. You're a busy, busy person, right? With a bunch of different adventures that you have going on, including. Are you still jumping out of airplanes? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a smart thing.
I did that mostly before I started having kids. if it wasn't for that. I wanted to make one jump one time when I was an au pair in California, and I did it. And just because I wanted to see if I had the guts to do it, right?
Right.
Yeah. And then, my whole life changed because of that. I ended up in the US because of skydiving. So,
Well,
yeah.
that's a different entry than a lot of people. But anyway, you do have a lot going on. But I want to talk about when you started writing Wings of Freedom, because it's different than what you've done in the past and writing a full story. You sit down, you start writing this book, and you get to a point where you say, okay, the story's told, it's finished, because it does. It's one of those parts in history that has a beginning and an end that we can find out about. But then you have to turn it into a book. It has to be proofread. It has to be edited. It has to be changed and things taken out or things put in. Tell us, how did that go for you, Bibi?
Well, I had made mostly coloring books up to this point. So the first edition of Wings of Freedom was actually a coloring book. And that's, oh, you can't see it.
There you go. That's better.
There you go. And that's the images you see behind me right now. And so the concept is you have a coloring page and you have text to go with it. And in this book, it's bilingual English and German. And so I started off with that concept. And in the beginning, I'm like, not knowing anything about the airlift, I'm like, well, can I get 20 pages, In the end, I had to stop myself at 43 pages and, pull the plug because it gets more and more expensive, especially for printing. And so that's how I landed on that. And the writing and editing, yes, that's still like I just yesterday sent an image to my book layout person because there was, the German umlauts. There was one word misspelled that had the umlaut dots on the wrong word. And so you will read it over and over, and every time you will find something. I think that process, at some point, you just have to say, this is good to go out to the publics and be read,
Yes.
And,
Yes, you do.
yeah. So, yes. And then that was published right around the 75th anniversary. And then I had some of the older generation say, this is great, but it's hard for me to see and I wouldn't color this. It's too detailed. So I decided to have my designer color the images. And then it came out as a book with colored images,
Very nice.
Well, all the same thing. Yeah, I like this page with all the numbers. And then again, text on the other side. And yeah, it's been doing really well. And I have, museums and different organizations sell it throughout the US and in Europe.
And that is a big part of what we do is writers, storytellers, independent writers, is when we create something. There's always a process. It can be painful, especially when you have illustration, right? Because you got to get those things to line up perfectly and lay out the way you want them to lay out. Do you do your own illustrations?
No, I have a graphic designer that I work with. And interestingly, for this book, it was a lady from the Ukraine.
Really?
I think that is, like, in the grand scheme of things, so interesting, because she's from the Ukraine and they were at war with Russia. She had escaped, lives in Poland now, and she was the one to do these images.
A partnership never would have come about if the Wings of Freedom had not first come about so many years ago. Then we had to promote our books. We have to let people know about them. You mentioned that you had some people helping you along that and getting the message out there. What have you found the most effective way to promote your book or all of your books for them?
It depends. Different books, different ways to promote it. For this one in particular, I just went like that 2 years ago. I went to all the events and there were some like big celebrations, like in the one in Frankfurt Wiesbaden at the US base there, European base. They had a big celebration with, I don't even remember, 60,000 people. I don't know if that was one day or all 3 days. I don't know. But we had a table there with an airlift organization that's based in Frankfurt, and I was able to sell books there and do book signings. And also I go around and speak. I love telling the story because it is so remarkable. And, it's a story of unity too, and cooperation and communication, I mean, look at what we can accomplish when we work together, put our heads together. And so that I promote the books that way too. And they're, of course, available on Amazon and through all the bookstores. but mostly through different organizations and the museums that sell them.
And I think that's really it's a added benefit of writing this type of story because there are people that are interested in it. You have to be on Amazon. It's the world's largest bookstore, but people don't necessarily go there with one thing in mind where when you're dealing with these different organizations, it's fresh, it's on top of their mind. And I think it's very beneficial, especially if you're a writer of history. I'm passionate about history. I write historical fiction and I'm always fearful that we'll forget everything that happened in the past.
Yes.
And like they
And
say, go ahead.
that's one of the reasons why I want to do the Voices of the Airlift project, because they will not be around forever, and to capture these stories. And some of them are so touching and moving, their memories. And it never just starts with the airlift either, because the people that remember, they were children maybe back then, but a lot of them remember the war and the end of the war, and then they say, finally, the bombing stopped, and then the next thing is like, and then the Russians came. And I get goosebumps because it's never a good story after that sentence. And what they did back then in Berlin and Germany, it's horrible, some of the stories.
I'm excited for you to make progress with that because we're 80 years, 85 years away from a lot of that stuff. And the people that were there, well, they're not going to live forever.
Yes.
And we don't want their stories to go away. You titled it The Voices of the Airlift. Did I get that right?
Yes, Voices of the Berlin Airlift. There's a website I can send you them.
Well, I do. And we'll put the links to that, guys, in the show notes, along with the links to Wings of Freedom, also your website, and get people just learning about this and reading about these things. I'm very interested in this other story. Is this one that you think would be good in audiobook?
I think it could be. People read their own stories, or if we weave in some of the recordings that I have from when they tell me their stories, it could be. And I'm also trying whenever I can to do video interviews, but some of the people don't really want to get in front of a camera. But, when I can, I do that. And then I can, put things on my website on YouTube also for people to just watch, because not everybody wants to read books. And
Now, you can't say that on the Storyteller Podcast.
well,
We want to believe, we the we that's here want to believe that everybody still loves to read, but Audible books are a big part of our world. Same thing with the ebooks; they're so popular nowadays. Storytelling is not a lost art; it's been around since the beginning of time, and it'll be around long after you and I are gone off into the nether world. So it's a very important thing, storytelling. And you're doing, I think you're doing history. You're doing your home. It's been a while since you lived there, right? But it's still
it's personal to me,
yes.
I have
And
some personal connection to it.
and keeping that, it's important to keep these stories alive.
I think so.
And I think you're doing a very good job of doing that. Again, we'll put all the links in there. Tell us a little bit about Culture to Color. That is your website?
Yes, that's my business, actually. That's what I really do full time. And it started, I've always loved to take pictures. And I have a sister-in-law that works in a gallery in California. And she said one day, if you want to show your pictures, bring them here and we can exhibit them in the gallery. So I went there and did that, and that was fun and all. But I found a coloring book there that was done by a local photographer who had turned his photography and turned them into adult coloring pages with like Zentangle patterns behind them and stuff. And I thought, what fun, and I could do that about my little hometown here that I've lived in for almost 30 years at the time, and went back home and jumped right into it because it seemed like a fun thing to do. I wanted to have more than just the coloring pages. I wanted some information. So I added text under each image. And that was the start of it, really. I don't know if you know that adult coloring is a really big market. It's a multi-billion-dollar market, and any bookstore you go to, you will find adult coloring books. And so I started with that book, and I decided I wanted to talk to everybody, because this little town, it has some sites, but it also has some unique businesses, like, a drop zone for skydivers. It's considered the skydiving capital of the world, DeLand, Florida. And so I went and talked to everybody to make sure they're okay to be in the book and, their business featured and stuff. And that was a lot of fun. And I just kept going after I published the first book, and my CPA said, well, you better set it up as a business if you're going to do that. But I realized pretty quickly, like by the third book, that it's really difficult to make a living, creating books and selling them. Because as you know, when you sell them on Amazon, a book that costs $15, you get maybe $1 per minus. It's a hard way to make a living unless you sell hundreds of thousands. And so then I did a book about endangered animals of North America. That was the first children's book. And it's bilingual, English and Spanish is the text. And then it has really cute images of animals to be colored. And I had friends and local business owners that I know sponsor each page. So that paid for the creation of the book. And then I thought I could get it into all the zoos and aquariums around North America. Well, turned out also that's very difficult because there's that middleman. And if you only have one product that's interesting for them, I don't know. I couldn't figure it out. And then I made a connection through a friend to a lady in Chinatown in San Francisco. She runs a nonprofit organization. And it was right at the beginning of COVID, and we sat down and we talked, and she says, can you do a book for us and about us? Because it was tough times back then for the Asian communities. So I said, yes, I can do that. And so they paid me upfront to create this book for them. And so new idea was born. This is a much better business model. And we decided to position ourselves as a marketing company that's specializing in explainer coloring books as marketing tools for businesses, organizations, destinations, you name it. And we've now published 50 books or so, and with different topics, different destinations, and that's a much better business model. But then Wings of Freedom came around, and that's just a pure passion project and has turned my life upside down and in completely new directions. And so I do both.
That's the little storyteller living inside of you. They're very quiet until something touches them, something wakes them up, and this story has obviously woken you up. I look forward to you continuing. And I wasn't aware that the adult coloring book was a multi-billion-dollar industry until I recently had a gentleman on that's what he does is adult coloring books, and he had reached out to me and he says, "Do you want to do this?" I'm thinking, is that really storytelling? And then he sent me his stuff, and I thought, wow, this is pretty incredible. I want to keep hearing your stories, Bibi. I'm looking forward to your next book. Do you have a timeline on Voices?
Well, the 80th anniversary is coming up in 3 years, 2028. They'll
Right.
be celebrating the 80th anniversary. I'm hoping to have it done before then, but it's a lot of work. So that's another reason why I started the nonprofit, because I feel like people who are interested in this kind of stuff could get involved and help me with like the transcripts and things like that. There are things that I could hand off and get some help with making progress on this.
Well, I'm glad you've taken that mission.
4 years, because I'm still right now, my high priority is to focus on the people who were there, who are still alive, the airlift kids mostly. There are a handful of veterans still around. Like I found one in a retirement home here in Orlando at 102.
That's amazing.
Yes, and he was willing to be interviewed on camera, and I got there and he had put on his uniform.
Well,
Still fit, right? And he told me everything, his whole life story, spent 2 hours on camera telling me his story, including the airlift. And it's just really incredible.
was he part of the airlift? Wow. Wow, that's incredible.
And then I meet other people in Berlin, this 80-some-year-old gentleman who was a teenager during the airlift. And then later, of course, the Berliners, they always then have stories about the wall being built and the wall coming down. And so this one particular gentleman told me he was involved in helping build 8 tunnels under the wall. So there are more stories, maybe after this, I go that direction with Berlin during the Cold War. I don't know, but it's fascinating, the stories I hear.
It is. And when you think about that time, you're really, in the respect of all time, you're talking about a very small window of time. where just hundreds, if not thousands, of incredible stories came out of. And again, to have a storyteller writing about those, talking about those, and even providing people a relaxing way to learn about them by coloring those is, I think,
And schools can use it.
and you're right. You mentioned it a couple of times during the podcast that this needs to be back in schools. History needs to be part of it. When I think back, and I've been out of school for a long time, but when I think back to from middle school, we called it, I think, junior high way back then, but during those times, all the way through rest of schooling, it's the history teachers that have always, those are the ones I remember, right? Because they were not only were they teaching history, I think all of them were true storytellers in telling that. And even today I remember some of the stories that they told, because I was 14, 15 years old, and they were talking about things that happened in the 40s and the 50s because they had lived through those things. And those stories are still fresh in my mind. And now I find out that in history, they've narrowed it down to, starting in the year 2000, as if nothing ever happened before the year 2000, and it's,
I talked to a teacher, high school teacher in Berlin, and she says history ends at World War II in Germany or in Berlin. I don't know the rest of Germany. So I ask you, if you don't learn about the Cold War in Germany and the division and the wall, like most kids, some kids in Berlin don't even know the wall existed. But how do people understand the current history if they don't know about our relationship with the Soviets, with the Americans? How can they understand the world they live in? You know?
yeah, they can't. They can't. And that's why, sadly, you hear people today say that none of that stuff really happened.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's just not.
Day that were there. I just met a 101-year-old World War II veteran that has incredible stories.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
memorabilia. And he's still like, I called him and I said, let's get together. And he's like, well, let me check my schedule. And I thought he was joking. Really, right? But he goes to schools and churches like a lot to tell the stories. He says, people need to know, children need to know. And he brings an old Luger, a German pistol, and tells the stories and has all these. He went to Berlin and took a Hitler flag, a Nazi flag off some building, and he still has that. And
Wow.
he was there when they opened the concentration camps, and it's hard for him to talk about.
I imagine I'm glad that he's doing that, that, that because there's got to be scars in there that are very hard to reopen for anybody to tell those things. Her name is Bibi LeBlanc. The name of the book is Wings of Freedom, a tribute to the Berlin Airlift. And then after that, it's also in German. The links are down in the show notes, so you know where to go to get these. Help. Not only are you helping a storyteller, an author, keep her dreams alive, but by buying these books, sharing these stories, you're helping keep history alive, history where it needs to be. It needs to have a pulse all the time, because when that pulse stops and history is gone, sadly, it's gone forever. So you know what to do. Thank you, Bibi, for coming on to the Storyteller Podcast, telling your story. Stay in touch with me. I'm really excited about the voices. It's an incredible project for you to tackle. And I know it's going to be very, very difficult to put all of that together and time consuming. And if you can get it done before the 80th, that would be great. But if not, that's okay too. It's more stories that need to be told. And if you need any help with that, let me know. You can always reach out to me. Thank you again. One last question for you. If you could go back to that time when you were still living in Germany and you had found out about this story then, would it have changed the way your life turned out?
I don't think so. I wouldn't have been so unhappy with the wall, because now I realize growing up with the wall was the lesser of two evils, because if they hadn't been successful, I would have grown up under the Soviets, like I said before. I would have come to terms with that earlier in my life, but then again, gave me a reason to leave and go explore the world. And
And a reason to jump out of airplanes?
planes, yes. I took my parachute everywhere. I jumped in some interesting places. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, one quick last question. Were you in Germany when the wall came down? Oh, you were there.
Yes. I was in Frankfurt at the time, and I was a flight attendant, and I came home from a flight one night, and my mom called me And she said, the wall just came down. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I was never in the realm of possibilities that would ever happen in my lifetime. And I still get chills. And she's like, yeah, the wall just fell. And so my roommates and I jumped into the car and started driving towards Berlin because we had to be there. And on the Autobahn in West Germany, we saw the Trabis, the iconic East German cars, come the opposite direction. And it was the eeriest sensation, because we had never seen them there before.
Right.
So we get to the first checkpoint where you had to drive into East Germany to then, continue on to Berlin. And it was like a cold, dark November night, and it would have been deserted on any normal day. But when we got there, was cars parked left and right on the Autobahn for hundreds of yards. And there were West Germans welcoming the East Germans through that checkpoint with like thermos bottles of hot tea and hot chocolate. And it was a big celebration, It was hugging and crying and laughing and dancing, and it was incredible. I will never forget that.
You see, you guys, that's why she's a storyteller, because in just a short 2 minutes, she took us to a place that none of us listening right now, or if anybody listening right now would be surprised, experienced what you experienced from that point of view, from a child who had grown up seeing this menacing wall and knowing what was on the other side of that wall, to a night where you drove through it as freedom was ringing. That's an incredible story. Thank you again for coming on the podcast. God blessings to all that you do, Bibi LeBlanc.
Thank you, Jim.